Hello, this is Natalia from Idaho State University. Today I will be discussing how to format a lab report. We will look at both a basic outline of the lab report format and a detailed example of a completed lab report. But first, some quick reminders before starting your lab. Before the lab, if possible, please read through the lab handout and get an idea of what you will be doing during this lab time. And you can find this lab handout usually on Moodle a couple days before the scheduled lab. And on the day of the lab, make sure to keep a record of all equipment that you've used and also write extensive notes that detail the work that you've done and the expected and actual outcomes of each portion of the lab. And even for group work, it is important to remember that reports must be written individually and submitted on time only through Moodle. So you won't hand in an actual lab report, you just submit that via Moodle. Okay, so here we can see an outline of the lab report format. First up, we put the date of the lab. And if the lab was completed over the course of 2 or more days, be sure to include each date in this section. And next you will include your own name and your student ID number. Your 9-digit student ID number can be found by logging on to BangleWeb, and it is located on the Home tab under the heading ISU ID on the left-hand side of the screen, as shown here. So next up is to state the purpose of the lab. Here you should include an overview of the topics and objectives covered by the lab. You can also consult the lab handout for more background information on this subject. So after stating the purpose of the lab, you will need to provide a list of all components, devices, reference materials, or anything else that you have used to complete your lab report. And you'll want to make sure to get the names of the devices correct, as well as any measurements. If you're using like resistors, make sure you give the resistance of that, and if you're using different chips, make sure you give the number for that. Now comes a detailed description of the process and outcome of each portion of the lab. This will likely be the largest part of the report, so it's important to gather a lot of information during the lab so you can fill this. For this section, try to answer the following prompts as completely as possible. So number 1 says, for each lab portion, describe what you did, including how you connected hardware and what software code was used. Include a copy of any code you used or wrote to do the lab, and you can screenshot that and also link it in your lab report since it's all online. And then 2, for each lab portion, state the outcome of the lab work and state whether you accomplished what you were supposed to or not, and just elaborate on that any way that you see fit based on what happened during the lab. And number 3 is to report on any problems or surprises you encountered on the way to completing any portion of the lab. So just explain what happened, why it happened, and just give as many details as you can. And number 4, how did you solve any problems you encountered? So yeah, just give your solutions for any issues that came up during the lab. And number 5, what did you learn from each portion of the lab? So this is just explaining what you gained from this experience. So next is to include any schematics, diagrams, screenshots, or photos relevant to the lab. And you can take photos of your connections using your phone, but try to make them as clear and legible as possible, and try to avoid glare or other obstructions in your photos or videos. And if you are going to take photos of the oscilloscope, you'll need to use the screenshot function of the oscilloscope to show all the measurements for the signals, but you could also take a sharp photo of the oscilloscope screen as long as the information is still visible. Okay, so in some cases you may need to record video demonstrations of your lab work, and they can be included in your lab report in the form of a hyperlink. So what I've done in the past is compile all of the necessary videos into one large video and just put title slides before each section and then upload that to YouTube. You can also make sure when you're uploading your video that you set it to unlisted, meaning that only those who have the link can view it. So this is a way that your video won't show up in searches, so keeps it a little more private. And after that, you can paste the link of that video and a brief explanation of what the video is showing into your lab report, and you can include timestamps to show the different parts of the video that represent the portion of the lab that you're currently discussing. So finally, we'll include the date that the lab report is being submitted, which is different from the due date of the lab. It's the day that you turn in your report, and you'll submit that through Moodle, not on paper, and that will be the end of your report. But again, here's just another reminder that you must do your own individual lab report and document your lab report thoroughly and completely, as your grade will depend on this. And it's important that you show up for the in-person lab in order to be able to write your report. So you can't really do a lab report for a day that you missed. So it's important that the lab report is submitted on time, because if it's late, it cannot be later than the deadline, and 25% will be deducted from your report grade. So it's in your best interest just to get that in on time. So now we'll look at an example of a completed lab report, and this is one of mine from last year. So here we have a title. You can give it the name of the lab report. That's always important to include. And then the date of the lab. Again, I completed this lab over the course of 2 different days, so I have to include both of those. Your name, student ID, and then the purpose of the lab. Give a brief description, maybe about a paragraph about what this lab is teaching, what you'll do in the lab, and just kind of what you'll get from it at the end, the basic objectives. And then the equipment used in the lab, you can record all of that in a list format. It doesn't really matter too much. So here, but just make sure that if you have something like the chips, you have the numbers that you used, and you just give an example of everything that you used to complete this lab. And then for the process and outcome of doing each portion of the lab, this is your big section. I typically would start most of my labs with an initial hardware setup and just explain how the connections are made for the breadboard in different projects. And it's almost the same thing to power it on for every lab, so it's beneficial if you want to put just this initial hardware setup. And then you can separate it into parts as listed in the lab handout, the different parts of the lab that you will complete, and then just give a play-by-play of how you approach this lab. Give all of your connections, all of the testing that you've done, all of the you can include the names of the equipment that you used, and give characteristics of what you did with that instrumentation. And then for images, these are listed as different sections on the lab report format, but you can include them just where they would naturally fit in the logic of your explanation. So they can be like, if you need an image for part 1, you can put that with part 1, or you could put all your images at the end. But the most important thing I would say for images is to have a caption and a figure number that you refer to in your explanations, just so that the grader can see what you mean by this. And also, under your images, give a description of, again, what the image is showing. That's a really important part. So there's part 2. And just kind of try to organize these as best you can. Follow the format of the lab handout. That would be my best advice for this. And if you need to, sometimes you can make tables, and again, the same rules apply for the figures and your images. You just need to give it a name. So here I've labeled it Table 1, and just give a description of what that table is showing. So there's more images. And this particular lab didn't include any video. It wasn't necessary, but for that, the same rules apply as the images and the tables. You would just have to label that video and include the link to maybe YouTube or wherever you would like to upload that. And just make sure that you give a description of what's happening in the video, maybe a timestamp of where in the video it takes place if it has multiple portions of the lab in one video. And yeah, just follow those guidelines. And then finally, just put the date that the lab report is being submitted, and your lab report is complete. So one last time, let me just reiterate these special reminders that will help you do the best that you can in your lab. You'll need to read the lab handout before class, keep track of all equipment, record all the work and your outcomes, and also write the report on your own, submit it via Moodle on time, and you should be good. If you have any questions about anything I've shown in this video or questions about your course in general, please feel free to contact your professor or lab TA via email. Their contact information is available on the class syllabus on Moodle.